Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My own presentation is somewhat different in character in that I want to ask to what extent this Cambridge critique is also empirically founded. Let me first look at the history of the debate once more. It has been explained by Heinz Kurz. As you can see from this chronology, it is very much concentrated in time on the few years between Joe Robinson's paper and the debate in which it was shown that reswitching could not be excluded. So what you see here in the sequence of events is Joan Robinson indicates that the measure of K is problematic. Sraffa in production of commodities by means of commodities implies more, but what he explicitly says that there is a problem with the period of production. And he, on the other hand, admits that there is a rapid succession of switches on the wage curve, so that he admits that if distribution changes, a great many possibilities of substitution will come about. Garignani goes into a somewhat different direction. We shall talk about that later. Samuelson tries to show that if a simplification is made, that is, the capital intensities are the same in different sectors of production, that then the production function exists. This is in contradiction which was implied by Sraffa, and so Samuelson's pupil Lev Hari tries to show that if one compares systems which are indecomposable, which are basic in the sense of Sraffa, that then reswitching cannot happen. Now, that turns out to be false. Samuelson admits it, and that's where the debate stops for quite a while. There are then new departures, and Heinz Kurz has mentioned some of them. But the one which I found really challenging to the debate have not been mentioned, and that is that in a number of papers by authors such as Ochoa, Petrovic, Sheikh, Mariolis, and Tsufildis, it has been shown that empirical wage curves are nearly linear. Now, if empirical wage curves are nearly linear, one is close to Samuelson's construction after all. So therefore, who is right? Is Samuelson right, broadly speaking? Or is the abstract argument that the simple possibility that reswitching might exist sufficient to bring down all of neoclassical theory? That is a very grand postulate. Joan Robinson had that attitude, but it was not recognized by others. So therefore, one had to turn to empirical questions, and I shall, in this now, concentrate on my own work and try to show what I found sort of successively, and then it may be discussed in the general discussion whether that plays any role with respect to the debate at large. So what I found was with a student of mine, Hahn, that reverse capital deepening was rare and one empirical example of reswitching, and the question is, what do we do with that? So we have to be a little more precise and look at the construction. You here see two wage curves which pertain to one system in which in one industry you have two methods of production to choose from. That's the classical case of choice of technique, and it has been drawn to show reswitching. In that, of course, if the rate of profit is low, one chooses the technique with the highest wage rate, which would be beta, close to R equal to 0. Then comes alpha as the rate of profit increases. And reswitching means you paradoxically return to beta again. Now, that implies that as one turns from alpha to beta, the intensity of capital rises. This may happen also if there is yet another technique which eliminates the first switch from the envelope, in that gamma dominates alpha, where alpha intersects with beta for the first time. But the paradox at the switch point between alpha and beta, the paradox here persists in that the intensity of capital, as long as you have alpha, is low, and as you go to beta, the intensity of capital rises. That is a capital reversal which is due to a change of technique. A change of technique in that in one industry one method changes. Now there is another kind of capital reversal, the so-called Wicksell effects. Here we have only one technique, and consider what happens as the rate of profit changes. And as you can see, with this curvature of the wage curve, an increase in the rate of profit will increase this angle alpha, and the tangent of angle alpha is the intensity of capital, something which had been pointed out very early, in particular by Christian von Weizsäcker. Now, if you have such a, as it's then called, non-neoclassical or perverse Wicksell effect, you have an instability, as you have it with the first case here of the reverse capital deepening, an instability in that we can look at it in various forms, but I'm interested in the simplest form, and that is what happens to the stability of the labor market. Suppose you have a less than full employment situation. Suppose there's an immigration, there are more workers, the wage rate falls. As the wage rate falls, the intensity of capital increases. Therefore, with a given amount of capital, you employ even fewer workers, and in that sense, you move away from a full employment equilibrium instead of going towards it. And that is, I think, the most simple, most fundamental, but also most important paradox which has here been discovered. Now, the question is that empirically well-founded? Can one encounter that frequently or not? Now, in 2006, we found that if you have many techniques in that you compare different input-output systems, where for each sector you can choose from two methods of production. Let's say you compare the technology of France and of Germany, and you can say both produce cars, and there is a French method and a German method. And the question then is, which is better? So you have many possibilities, and if you have these many possibilities, you can look at each switch point, whether it implies a capital reversal or not. And as we found, more than 95% of the cases are neoclassical, in that the intensity of capital falls with an increase in the rate of profit, and in the sector concerned, more labor is used, as you would also expect from the neoclassical point of view. Now, I had been educated in Cambridge. I firmly believed in the paradoxes of capital theory, and I was very surprised. And the question is this representative, and what does it mean for the neoclassical theory? Now, we found a second curiosity. The second curiosity was that if you have so many wage curves, which from combinatorial possibilities, why is it the case that only so few appear on the envelope? So in this case, with two input-output tables with 33 sectors, in this simple form of comparison, you get 2 to the power of 33 individual wage curves, but only 10 appeared on average on the envelope. That is 1 in 10 million, and everything else is below. So the substitution possibilities are far fewer than expected. And this is against neoclassical theory. Now, technology advances, and Zambelli in Trento has found a method to calculate, which is really not trivial, wage curves if you have many countries, so that you can compare the methods of many countries and can calculate a wage curve, an envelope of the wage curves which are combinatorially possible for all of the countries taken together, assuming that they produce a kind of average output. And he found that with this enormous number of wage curves, only 64 appeared on the envelope. This envelope stretches from 0 to 250% because Zambelli does not look at fixed capital. He looks only at circulating capital. And so we have this long stretch of the rate of profit. Now, if you look at this envelope, you find that in the range which is relevant, which is certainly below 50%, there is virtually no substitution at all. Then comes a sequence where we have Wicksell effects, which are all perverse, and here we have neoclassical Wicksell effects. So that is a first approach at reality, and we expect, of course, that with further empirical research, one will see more of such wage curve analyses of this type. And the provisional conclusions are, one can discuss this for quite a while, there are stretches where there's virtually no substitution. There can be the non-neoclassical case and the neoclassical case, but there is no reswitching, no reverse capital deepening anywhere in this diagram. How can we explain that? So we now have to go back to theory in order to explain a reality which is somewhere intermediate between the extreme neoclassical postulates are altogether absurd and they function. Now, what do we find? Well, the first kind of answer is if wage curves are more or less straight, as in the Sheikh school, I had showed that in the beginning, people like Ochoa and Petrovich, if the wage curves are more or less straight, then Samuelson's surrogate production function works after all. So we have to ask, under what conditions are wage curves straight? Now, we know from traditional theory that, of course, in the case of the standard commodity, the wage curve is straight. but the standard commodity is specific to the technique, and if we compare many techniques, we can only take the standard commodity of one technique, and so only one wage curve will be straight and the others will not. So that doesn't help. The labor theory of value case, well, if the labor theory of value holds, because the right-hand eigenvector is equal to the labor vector, that's the condition, the mathematical condition to have the labor theory of value in such rougher systems. If we have that, then we have Samuelson's case, but it was exactly the point that the labor theory of value does not hold generally. Now, the discovery was that there is another possibility to get straight wage curves, and that is if the matrix, not the relationship between the matrix and the labor vector or the standard, but if the matrix itself has a curious property, that is, if it is random. Now, if we get random matrices and also have a kind of relation between the labor vector and the input-output vector, which is weaker than the labor theory of value, but stronger than full generality. That's a kind of covariance condition which we have here. In this case, we get straight wage curves. Now, if this condition 3 holds, an approximate surrogate production function exists after all, which I showed in the Cambridge Journal, and essentially the same conditions suffice to solve the transformation problem with what for Marx was the most important aspect of the transformation, that is, that he could represent profits as a redistribution of surplus value. In another paper, I have shown, or I try to show, that this is really the key to the understanding of the Marxian production, of the Marxian construction, how he goes from the first volume to the third, that he has first labor values and then shows exploitation and wants to show that there is surplus value and that when then the rate of profit becomes uniform, this means only that the same surplus value is redistributed as profit. And so it can be shown that these essentially same conditions suffice to obtain this case. And finally, it turns out that this assumption is also sufficient to make what I call the old neoclassical equilibrium work. Garignani had pointed out, I had him in the beginning in my list with his very important thesis of 1960. Garignani had pointed out that the neoclassical authors, Ricardo, Marx, the classical authors, had in common a concept of natural price or price of production or normal price, which is formalized by the Sraffa system. And they had tried to produce or tried to approach a notion of general equilibrium, not with intertemporal prices, but based on that construction of the normal position, of the long period position, where the rate of profit is uniform, and try to explain that rate of profit by means of supply and demand of the factors of production. Now, this old neoclassical equilibrium is stable and therefore works in this sense of a macroeconomic stability condition, as we had discussed when we were looking at the Bixel effect. It turns out that that works exactly also under these same conditions. So the entire neoclassical framework, but also part of classical theory, is based on this view that the economy has this random structure, and this becomes more explicit in Marx than in the others. I don't think anybody ever believed that you could have a perfect production function. I mean, that's absurd. Why should you have a perfectly smooth production function if the reality is discrete? So that was always a discussion of approximations. But the question is, are the approximations good or not? And that is where we stand in our discussion. Now, as I said, my work up to here is based on the assumption of random systems. These random systems imply that all the eigenvalues of the matrix are small. Now, against my early position, I had to find that not all eigenvalues are small. But to some extent, there is a compensation if there are few eigenvalues, except the dominant eigenvalue, which are not small. There may be a compensation because of this condition, the covariance condition, and therefore the whole thing may hold up to a point nevertheless. So I did another work in which I tried to show, independently of randomness, that reverse capital deepening is rare, and that it is rare because if the dimension increases, the set of vectors which can give rise to reverse capital deepening shrinks to zero, shrinks to a set of zero. I cannot discuss this in detail. Let me look at another matter, at the Wicksell effects. So I conclude basically that reverse capital deepening is out. But Wicksell effects are certain. Small Wicksell effects are certain. In that if you have a given technique, you can always have a numeraire such that you get the perverse Wicksell effect, or a numeraire that you get such that you get the ordinary Wicksell effect. If you do that in 3 dimensions and have here the set of possible numeraires, you have here the standard vector, and you get a straight line which divides the set of numeraires which give rise to perverse Wicksell effects from the set of cases where the Wicksell effects are not perverse. Hence, Wicksell effects will always exist, but they may be small, and they will come about in groups. There is a theoretical argument which, if you like, confirms what we have seen on the Zambelli curve here, that you have a whole area where they are perverse and a whole area where they are neoclassical. There is a theoretical argument why that must be so. So we can, with this, more or less explain more or less well how the actual wage curve which we find empirically, why they have the shapes and the behavior that we observe. So to this extent, the theory is successful. But there is one thing which is lacking, and that is why are there so few wage curves on the envelope? I once asked Joan Robinson whether she thought that there were many or only a few wage curves on the envelope when I was a student. So that was 50 years ago. And she said, well, I think one technique is going to dominate all. Now, if the wage curves are more or less straight, and I have now drawn them as straight, the likelihood that if I have, for instance, 3 wage curves, only one dominates, and if the ordering of the wage curves according to the wage rate at R equals 0 and the maximum wage rate, if these 2 orderings are completely independent, then the probability is only 1/3 that this happens. The Samuelson case was that the maximum rates of profit are inversely related to the ordering of the wage curves that are equal to 0. And the probability for that is 1 over the S faculty if S is the number of wage curves. And so I could show that one can calculate the expected likelihood of the number of wage curves of the envelope, and it turns out that it is smaller than the logarithm of S. Therefore, we get a new kind of criticism. We get what I call poor production functions. Poor production functions in that because the wage curves are quasi-linear, the production function is not totally absurd. However, the possibilities of substitution are much more limited than one expects. And hence one can apply that among the many questions which can be asked with regard to capital theory, what kind of instabilities are there, to the particular case, what happens on the labor market. And that is so important because you read in the newspapers every day if there is unemployment that the real wage should be lowered. What do we find? This is my last slide. What do we find? Well, if there is a short-run fall of the wage rate, we can have a destabilization. But if it lasts, we cannot expect that we get an efficient improvement of employment because the production function may lack the necessary substitution possibilities. Now, that does not mean that lowering the real wage will always be wrong. There could be labor using technical progress, for instance. Or if real wages fall domestically but not abroad, you can get an increase in employment because of an increase in effective demand, because of a rise in exports. But the neoclassical postulate that we will always get an efficient technique which uses more labor if you use the real wage, that, according to our present knowledge, is quite questionable. Of course, there are many inefficient labor-using techniques. If we return from the plow to the spade, something which they discussed already in antiquity as a possibility, then, of course, everybody would be frantically working to maintain himself or herself. But that would be an inefficient technique and one below the envelope. So therefore, this neoclassical construction is a beautiful theory in itself, as are the classical theories, but actual reality is somewhat more complex. Thank you.